To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time and we have an absolute treat for you because
banger.
It is a banger. It's a total banger. Bangers only.
Bangers only.
We have John Burn-Murdoch of the FT who has written a fantastically interesting piece about where does economic growth come from. So this is the holy grail of all economics, which is how does a country go from being poor to being rich? What is the alchemy? What is the essential chemistry? How is it done? In Ireland, we have done it, and we're going to come back to this after our discussion. But John, it is something that's, has intrigued me. How does it actually work? And
Yeah. The nuts and bolts of it, but it is one of those things. If there was a formula, and if you could bottle it up, well, then hey ho, we'd be all.
I'd be out of a job. I'd be out of a job, and you don't want that.
Are you in a job at the moment?
A makey-uppy job. A makey-uppy job. You know, as I was telling you about that book, David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs idea. Yeah. It's a good book. But no. And there are many, many theories, but most economic theories are what I would call mechanistic.
Yeah.
Right? They take a relative price here, a change there, they put them together and say, hey ho, there is a slightly almost mechanistic way that if you arrive at this thing, then the economy will just grow by itself, right? I'm not sure that's the way it works. In fact, you know that I don't. I think the mood, I think the culture, I think the society, I think the sociology, I think what is embraced, what is not embraced, what is given prominence, what is not given prominence. I think these things are hugely important in society.
But it's why economics is not a science. And it's as much as we say it all the time that, it's as much about kind of humanity and society and all of that.
All that good stuff. Yeah, no, it is. It's a sort of a very soft science that was made hard by economists who didn't make it as mathematicians, right? So economics is full of failed mathematicians who weren't that good at sums, but were better than most people. Right?
Yeah.
And in order to dignify the pursuit of economics, what they decided was to come up with these models, John. And these models gave it a hardness. It's kind of like we're almost doing physics here, right?
Yeah. Pie charts and
all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But then you go back and you look at actually what makes the economy tick. Now, John has done an amazing, amazing piece of work. So why don't we talk to John, right? But his basic idea is that what is in the wind, so to speak. Remember Bob Dylan, John? You like Bob Dylan.
I did.
Bob Dylan said, what is blown in the wind? The answer, my friend, is blown in the wind. And what he was saying was that the answer to the society's problems is actually in the air somewhere.
Yeah.
You can grasp it. You can see it from student protests, or the way people believe or what they believe and how they're doing, right? So Dylan wasn't saying, go to one source. He says, take the culture, the broad culture, what's blowing in the wind, and there is where the answer is.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think the same thing is going for economics, that the answer is in deep culture. So let's talk to John and let's come back and have a chat afterwards about what it means for Ireland. So let's go over to the UK, talk to John Burn-Murdoch.
Let's go.
I am reading a most fascinating article by John Burn-Murdoch. You will know John. He has been on the pod a number of times, so much so that he was coaxed, I wouldn't say against his will, but maybe against better advice, down to Kilkenomics last year. And I think one of the gigs that sold out quickest was a gig with John, which was called Telling Stories with Data. And this is in many ways the holy grail of the economics journalist, the economics communicator, the economics teacher, is to take data, but demystify it, humanize it, and actually tell the story of data. And I've always thought that data is evidence. If you look back in the past, if you're looking for evidence, if you actually decide that you're an economic sort of private investigator, it's data that is your evidence, and it gives you all the plots and the way to frame your story. And John is a master at it, and he's on the line. John, great to see you.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, I must say, in Kilkenny, I never thought I'd see the day when a theatre was packed out with people to hear a couple of nerds talking about numbers and charts. So
yeah, listen, we in actual fact, speaking of numbers and charts and graphs, I was reading something bizarre about a man called John Playfair. And John Playfair was a Scottish engineer who not only orchestrated the biggest forgery of French banknotes in the 1790s, but was the first man to introduce pie charts and lines and graphs into economics.
We actually, at the FT, our in-house charting tool that we first made about 7-8 years ago was initially called Playfair.
No way. Excellent. Well, good stuff. Well, here, that's a genuflection to Mr. Playfair. In fact, he was the least fair play man in the whole world because he destroyed the French currency. So he's a bit of a bollocks, was our Mr. John Playfair. But he was the man who introduced graphics to economics. John, you have written an amazing piece. Take me through it. I would want you to explain to the listener what it is. It's a brilliant piece of economic unearthing.
Yes, well, thanks very much. And yeah, so this is it's a topic I've been interested in a while. It's just this idea of the interplay between culture, language, and economics. And what sparked this idea for me was a paper that came from 4 economists led by a man called Ali Al-Melhem. This paper was called Enlightenment Ideals and Belief in Progress in the Run-Up to the Industrial Revolution, a Textual Analysis. Just trips off the tongue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm buying that. I'm going out right now. I'm on Amazon as we speak.
But yeah, so they did this paper last month, so it's very recent. And what they wanted to look at was how did the way people talk about society evolve in the years leading up to and during the takeoff of the Industrial Revolution. So this is obviously a really interesting question that people have played with for ages, right? Anyone who's been interested in the economy and in why the Industrial Revolution happened when and where it did has wanted to know what are all the factors that could have been playing a role here. So one of the sort of most compelling arguments that has been made is by a US economic historian called Robert C. Allen. And he looked at this in a very sort of data-driven way. And his argument is that it can all be explained by fairly straightforward economics. So his theory basically goes that Britain in the 16th and early 17th centuries was really making a huge success of global commerce. And this led to a couple of things. One is a significant increase in labor costs, in wages. And the other is that in an indirect way, because this in turn led to population increase, the increase in population, particularly in cities like London, meant that there was no longer enough wood to heat homes. And so people had to start exploring things like coal instead. So you had these two factors. You had the increase in wages, labor costs, and the decrease in costs of fuel, because we suddenly discovered this very energy intense fuel in coal. And that combination meant that in Britain at that time, you had high labor costs, you had low energy costs. And so it incentivized the substitution of energy and capital for labor. That allowed rapid mechanization of manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's your sort of the main, you could call it the hard theory of the Industrial Revolution.
So that's the sort of standard theory based on sort of relative prices, economics, Britain having had an advantage in commerce, and away we go. And that explains it. That's one idea.
Yes, so that's one pretty solid theory. Then other people talk about things like the role of institutions in the UK. So you had things going on at this time, like you'd had the Civil War, you had slightly less power for the crown. This led to the creation of space for private financing, and maybe that played a big part. Other people argue that it was almost entirely endogenous, and the simple fact that you had more and more people over time gathering together, intermingling, bouncing ideas around, it was kind of inevitable that in parts of the world where population was growing faster, which was certainly true of London at the time, you would just get more ideas emerging. So those are many theories that you get. But then there's another school of thought, and I think one of the most prominent people advancing this is a Israeli-American economic historian called Joel Mokyr. And he's argued across a body of work that cultural change was a key part of sort of laying the groundwork, creating fertile ground for the Industrial Revolution. So the theory there is that you had prominent British thinkers at the time, so people like Francis Bacon and then Isaac Newton, who really came up with what was a completely novel framework for thinking about things at the time, which was this progress-oriented view of the world, and this view that we humans could take control of our destiny to some degree and to carry out experiments and tests and discover ways of making our lives better. And I think when some people dismiss this sort of cultural idea because they say, it's just soft and woolly and hand-wavy, but I think we fail to appreciate quite how revolutionary that thinking was at the time. This was a world where religion was still the absolute cornerstone of everything. And it was,
Yep.
we were here because of God, and God determined the quality of life we had. And, if you were a good Christian, a good Catholic, etc., things would go well for you. But this idea that we as a species, as a community, could improve our own lot was completely new. So that's the idea that Mokia brings along. And, he's not the only one, but that's where this comes from. That's why these researchers, these economists, did this paper. They wanted to test out whether that was true. Was there a shift in culture and language that happened around the 16th, early 17th centuries, which could explain why those ideas and then processes took off?
Well, I mean, I find it fascinating because this podcast always talks about economics and human nature and humanity being part of the same equation. And it's not about behavioral economics. It's not about pop psychology. It's about the idea of sociology matters. So a lot of economics, you think Schumpeter and all those guys, it's like there is a certain type of person, an entrepreneur, and they are in some way, they are psychologically disposed to take risks. The other idea is that societies can be sociologically disposed to encourage economics, risk-taking, venture, all that stuff. So let's talk about the evidence, because I find this absolutely fascinating.
Yes. So these team of researchers, what they did was they used this enormous library, enormous corpus of text, which is the result of digitizing books over centuries. So again, we think of anything digital as being modern, but this is books that have been turned into searchable text and essentially turned into sort of huge bundles of words, going back right the way to the year 1500, which is just astonishing when you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So you're like 40 years after the printing press. That's amazing.
Exactly. And this is all now just exists in text files in databases. So they analyzed this huge corpus of text, which contained the content of 173,031 books.
Amazing.
Indeed. So just this enormous amount of data. And these were books printed in England between the year 1500 and 1900. So, again, covers an enormous range of stuff. And what they did was they tracked the frequency of different words, different terms over time. And their particular focus in the context of this Industrial Revolution idea was words related to progress. So again, this is the stuff that the likes of Bacon and Newton were pushing, this idea that we can make the world better, we can make our lives better. And what they found was, and they were pretty careful about this. They made sure, for example, that they weren't just capturing words that describe general positivity and optimism, and they were also made sure to avoid words which could sort of come in and out of use for sort of synthetic reasons, for artificial reasons. And so they ended up with this bundle of words related to progress. And what they found was a very marked increase in the use of terms related to progress and innovation in these books published in England, starting in the early 17th century. So just before really the Industrial Revolution was coming into being. And I think that it's really key there to emphasize that point about before, because obviously some people might look at this and say, well, yeah, if society suddenly starts progressing, you're going to start talking about progress. But because they got the timing right here, you can quite clearly see that it was the cultural shift that preceded the technological shift. So you get this increase in people talking about progress, and then progress starts appearing. And again, it sounds almost sort of too convenient and nice, but when you consider the revolutionary nature of these ideas, I think it's certainly worth taking this argument seriously. And so they conclude that this supports the idea that a cultural evolution in the attitudes towards the potential of science, the potential of science, engineering, human activity, accounts in some part at least for the British Industrial Revolution and its economic takeoff. So that's their paper, which again I think is absolutely fascinating. And they went into incredible detail. There's reams and reams of stuff in there, different analyses they did. They also looked at what type of books this language was occurring in. So they split things broadly into books about religion, books about science, and books about political economy. And they found that this uptick in language around progress particularly comes in books at the nexus of science and political economy. So it's not just all in these sort of dense technical science books where you wouldn't necessarily expect that language to percolate through.
But can you say it's almost like 17th or 18th century popular science and popular scientific,
exactly
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
Exactly. So it's the kind of books that people who run businesses, who determine where capital goes.
If there were airports in the 18th century, the sort of books would be flogged there.
Exactly. Maybe they had them in the ports.
Yeah, exactly. Bewigged CEOs would have them under their arm as they go into the tavern, just to tell you, I'm this sort of guy. I'm the sort of guy who reads these sort of books. But go on, so it's popular science.
Indeed, yeah. So they've captured this quantifiable uptick in discussions about progress in science and innovation in books that a slightly broader audience of people might have read. And so I read this paper, I thought, absolutely brilliant, amazing work. And then I thought, well, there's a couple of things I wonder about this. One is, could we extend that to the modern day and see how that trend has continued past 1900? And the other is, what about if we look at different places, different cultures at that time? So an example that the authors actually allude to themselves at the very end of their discussion section of the paper is, what would this look like for Spain?
Okay.
Because the reason Spain is interesting is, up until the Industrial Revolution, Spain and Britain were very similar economically. So two nations with dominant navies, merchant navies, a huge amount of commerce by sea, and therefore, relatively speaking, at the time, were quite prosperous. But then when the Industrial Revolution took off in Britain, it decidedly did not take off in Spain.
Yeah.
You had the Reformation, which meant Northern Europe, including Britain, became more Protestant, whereas Spain was at the forefront of the Counter-Reformation, which remained very, very Catholic. So the emphasis on religion and on particular types of religion, you get this big divergence. And so what I thought is, well, can I find data which would allow me to ask this question? What do we see in terms of A, culture, and B, economic takeoff in Spain versus in Britain? And to do this, I used a tool which I've known about for a while, but never really dug into, which is called Google Ngram.
Ngram.
Google Ngram, so just Ngram. And the concept there is, an Ngram is a word count. But what Google have done is that anytime you search for anything online and Google gives you a result where it says that phrase that you searched for appears in this book, that's because Google has also digitized hundreds of thousands, millions of books. And controversially, they've even done this for books that are still within copyright in the last few years. And there was a whole case around this. And one of the reasons Google Ngram is still available is that it doesn't surface the full contents of any book. It's just treating every book as this massive bundle of words. So what they've got is, again, spanning centuries, digitization of books, of scientific articles, all this stuff. And crucially, they do this for a few languages. They've got it for English, which they split into British and American English. They've got it for Spanish, French, German. They even got it for simplified Chinese. And so what I thought is, well, I've got this data set here, which in theory allows me to do something very similar to what the authors of this paper have done. I can look back over hundreds of years, could go all the way back to the year 1600 or slightly before, and see how the usage, the frequency of words related to progress, same words that the authors of that paper used, how that changed. And I can do that for English and I can do it for Spanish. And sure enough, you see this almost 200-year lag between when that language took off in Britain and when it took off in Spain.
Wow, that is fascinating. So the Spaniards were not thinking about progress until, let's say, the 19th century, the late 19th century, whereas the British were thinking about it in the late 17th century.
Exactly. So in Britain, you see pretty much from the start of the 17th century, this increase in language around progress. So that's your sort of Francis Bacon in his prime kind of years, and then Isaac Newton. So from 16 to 1700, there's a steady upsurge in discussions about progress in science. In Spain, you just don't see that at all until about halfway through the 19th century. And the particularly interesting thing is if you then plot GDP per capita in Britain and Spain on that same timescale, you see something very, very similar. So this is using the Madison database of GDP, which goes back centuries, which you and a lot of your listeners will be aware of. And it's remarkable how similar those lines are. You in the same way that we saw with language around progress, you see a roughly 200-year lag in GDP takeoff in Britain and in Spain. And again, crucially, it's not just that these happen around the same time, it's that the uptick in discussion of progress happens just before the uptick in GDP per capita in both instances. Now, as anytime you do this kind of analysis, there will be a chorus of voices saying correlation, causation, you name it. And I think, well, this is the thing. I think, first of all, those people are not wrong. It's incredibly hard in science, and even in the hard sciences, let alone something a little bit fuzzier like this, to prove that one thing is causing the other. So I think we do need to say that this is an association. These things happen at the same time. We don't know if they're causing them. But when you combine that with the work of people like Joel Mokyr, there's a clear conceptual framework and theory for how and why one could have caused the other. So that was the really interesting thing in terms of Britain and Spain, which for me just gives a bit more weight to this idea that culture can indeed be a sort of leading indicator and can create the environment for economic growth. So that was the first thing that I thought was really interesting, and the bit of extension and adaptation that I did. But then the other thing I wanted to do, as I mentioned earlier, was what does this look like today?
Yeah, like what sort of books are we publishing today?
Exactly. And so in the Google data, you can take things right the way forward to 2019, which of course means we can see what's happened since the Industrial Revolution and in the last century. And that then was really striking. So for this stage, I'm using all books that have been published in the English language. So this includes British, American, and even books that are published in other parts of the world, but in English. So again, enormous data set. And what you see is you had this steady increase in language around progress, going from 1600 to 1700, then increasing even more as we go to 1800 and 1900. But then you have a sort of plateau from around the sort of mid-19th century through to the late 20th centuries. But it's funny, actually, I think of this as being up until we landed on the moon. So
fascinating.
Basically, the late 1960s, it was sort of peak discussion about progress and improvement and advances in the future. And then from the late 1960s to 2019, you've got this pretty pronounced decline in discussion around that language. So, it's still fairly high. We're still talking about progress about as much as we were in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, but it's really decreased quite considerably over the last 60 or so years. And so that in and of itself, I think, is really interesting, right? That's what's happened there. Like, is this a real cultural shift? And if so, what does that mean for the extent to which we are pursuing progress and technology as a society? But then the other thing is, if you look at the opposite worldview, as it were. So this is where I started looking at words like threat and worry and caution. And you see, again, a pretty flat level right the way through from the 16th century to the early 20th century. But then you get this steady increase and quite a steep increase at the very end of the 20th century and into the 21st. So at the same time as people are talking less about progress and improvements and betterment in the future, people are talking more about threats and worries and caution. And that, again, for me, is really interesting. And that, I suspect, will resonate with a lot of people who've been thinking about this, particularly in the last couple of decades, that we hear about more anxiety, we hear about people worrying more about all sorts of things. And so for me, this is just a fascinating chart to look at when we're thinking about the state of the world at the moment. You've got people saying things like they don't want to have kids because of the world they would be bringing those kids into.
Yeah.
We've also seen this sort of structural slowdown in economic growth in the developed world. And for me, it's just a great encapsulation of these things that we sort of feel, but have never been able to really put in numbers. And this chart, this data, I think really does that.
And what I find all this really fascinating, because what it does is it kind of gives a plausible explanation for what we are now angst-ridden about, which is the decline of the West, the decline of what happened to all this innovation. I was given a book by a very, very well-known tech entrepreneur called Where is My Flying Car?, which was written about what happened to all those innovations in the 1960s, so 1950s, 1960s. And as you said, interestingly, one would have thought that landing on the moon would have been the propulsion mechanism for even more discoveries. But in what you're saying, and what this book is saying, is that, in fact, the late 50s, mid to late 60s was the high point of innovation. And as a result of that, we've gone backwards. So the idea of having flying cars was regarded as, that's going to happen. And for a variety of cultural, but not economic reasons, and not engineering reasons, and not technical reasons, we haven't got there. And what I find brilliant about this, John, is it explains this nexus between culture, innovation, to a degree risk-taking, although I think that expression has been besmirched and over-politicized, and the broader economy.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it's funny you mentioned the besmirching of risk there, actually, because one of the words I actually left out of this analysis was risk, because you see this. I mean, this is going off at a tangent, but you get a surge
tangents
in
are
talk
all
about
good in this
risk.
podcast. This podcast is a very tangential engagement with the world.
You better
Excellent.
believe it.
Basically, you get this surge in conversations about risk for a sort of synthetic reason, which is that economics and finance now use risk just in a much more general way, which didn't used to be the case. So I kept that out because otherwise it was sort of distorting the extent to which we're all worried about things now.
Look at the pair of us thinking the same way straight away. No, but it is true because risk has been incredibly politicized as well. And it says, I'm that type of risky person, that person doesn't take risk and therefore they're not entrepreneurial and they're not go-getting. But the idea that the link between progress and science and innovation and kind of futurology in a way.
Yeah.
And again, people will, understand, we go back to the airport edition idea. So many books about anxiety, so many books about the threats in the outside world, so many books about where we've gone wrong, all that sort of stuff. And it seeps into the culture and the culture seeps into it. It's kind of a process of dual osmosis almost.
Absolutely. And this, it's been really interesting. One of the things I love whenever I do a piece like this, especially when I put it out on what we used to call Twitter, is you get all these replies and that's like, what does this make people think? And a common reply was people saying, well, it's no surprise that we talk more about caution and worry and risk now because the world's just much more scary. So, and I looked at that and I thought, the really interesting word there for me is scary, because the extent to which you're scared of something is as much, if not more, about the way you talk and think about that thing as the thing itself.
Precisely.
Like if you look at the last 70 years, 80 years, the period through which we've been talking more about worry and fear and caution, that's the period where we had 2 world wars, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Great Depression, all of these things. And during any given one of those periods, we talk less about caution and worry and fear than we do today. And so for me, what's changed is how we talk about these things. It's not the things themselves. And don't get me wrong, whether it's the environment, whether it's AI doom, there are genuine things to be worried about today. But I think for me, what's happened is there's almost this paradox where as you eliminate bad things which affect you yourself, that gives you the time and space to think about more bad things that don't necessarily affect you. And for me, that distinction is important because if you're worried about something that affects you, that can actually provoke a positive response from you. Like, how am I going to respond to this? This is something that I have some degree of control over. What's my solution? Whereas if you're thinking about dying coral reefs or
out there
AI
somewhere.
doom,
Yeah,
exactly. That then you've got all of the worries, you've got the anxiety, but you can't solve it yourself. And so I think, and this is just spitballing a theory, but I wonder if what we've done is by eliminating bad things in our own lives, like poverty has plummeted, life expectancy is getting better, health is getting better. We've got rid of those sort of immediate risks and concerns for ourselves, and we're now just worried more about bigger picture things. We're worried about things happening to other people, happening to other species. And those things are things that are just more inherently negative to think about.
John, it is endlessly fascinating. It is endlessly fascinating. I'm going to pick up the discussion with John afterwards, John Davis, rather than John Burn-Murdoch, with this. I don't know if you've read Deirdre McCluskey's Bourgeois Dignity, which is in that sort of area, trying to explain how the world changed. But I mean, any theory to me that explains how the economy takes off, how societies get wealthier, that has a cultural background noise to it, seems much more plausible than just inputs and outputs and mechanics. Again, as I come back, it's more sociology than mechanics.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think it's as always, the cop out is that it's all of the above, right? I think the theory we had at the start about what Rob Allen's work on cost of labor and energy, I think it's very compelling. But it's what sparked that in the first place. There were differences in costs and inputs, and we discovered different resources over centuries and centuries, and they didn't lead to that same takeoff. And as we say, Spain became aware of this stuff, and but didn't have the same explosion. So yeah, for me, there's definitely all of the things we discussed play a part in this. But I think the people who dismiss language and culture and just say, "Oh, that's all very hand wavy," I think, oh, they're wrong. So there you go.
John, we will leave it there. That is wonderful, wonderful stuff. You're obviously back in the Kilkenomics first 11, as you know, but it's great stuff, and I can't recommend listeners enough to go and have a look at that article by John Burn-Murdoch. It makes you think, and that's hopefully what great articles should do. So John, listen, brilliant stuff. See you soon.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Man, that is really fascinating stuff. It's fascinating stuff. And it's a completely different take, but it just brings to mind that phrase of words matter.
Words absolutely matter, and culture matters, and what society believes in matters. That's the key thing. What does a society believe in? Now, there's a great book on this, just an addendum to John's work, by Deirdre McCluskey, who is another Kilkenomics recidivist.
Right.
And she's written 3 books, one of which is called, she's written many books, but one is with this idea, it's called Bourgeois Dignity, Why Economics Can't Explain the Modern World. And this is all about what society believes in matters enormously. And what her basic idea is, she goes back to the Dutch, so John goes back to the British Industrial Revolution, she goes back to the Dutch Republic before the British Industrial Revolution. And she says, why do these things happen in Holland? Why did Holland get rich so quickly? And she makes the point that they began to believe in the future. So they began to believe in science and progress and all that sort of stuff. And that's what John is saying. And the level of detail he's gone into there is fascinating.
So it's a little bit like, art reflecting life and life reflecting art, and on which it's almost chicken and egg.
If we would decide that economics is art, John, which is you've elevated us onto
but it's what people,
deity status.
But it's what people are talking about, or what people are writing about, and all the rest.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And it's interesting. The other thing that I was thinking about when John was talking there was, in the 80s, there was a huge shift in thinking in Ireland in particular. And, you've written about this and talk about this a lot, about how the Irish economy exploded
in the 90s.
In the 90s as a result. But that kind of started in the 80s. And I was kind of thinking about, it's not only the books, it was MTV, it was the Starsky and Hutch from the 70s.
It was the outside influences.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and all those cultural influences through media, music, the whole lot.
Yeah, no, I think it's funny, John was talking about the high point of innovation, futurism, progression being the moon landing. I've always thought, I wrote that book, The Pope's Children, years ago, but I've always thought that the Pope's visit to Ireland in 1979, the Catholic Church absolutely believed that this would be a propulsion point for Catholicism in Ireland thereafter. It would be actually a propulsion, the Catholics and the Catholic Church will become stronger.
Yeah.
And that was the whole celebration of the Pope arriving. This was their big thing. Look, this is the big man. We have 1 million people in Phoenix Park. It turned out to be the high point, and it was the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
And if you look at the beginning of the end of Catholicism in Ireland, was when the Pope arrived. That's when it all started to fall apart. Even though the clergy thought it was going to be the beginning of a new dawn of Catholicism. And you can see...
And it was the Bishop Eamon Casey thing as well,
all that sort of stuff.
When they discovered that he had an 18-year-old kid in Boston. And that great piece of graffiti on the wall, which is, wear a condom just in case.
I know, it was really good. It was really, really good. But all those things.
Yeah.
So you see, so what John is saying is that England and Britain, between about 1700 and about 1720, goes through this convulsive period of science and all that sort of carry on. And this precedes the Industrial Revolution by about 50 years. So the change in the mood of the society sowed the seeds for the subsequent innovation.
Yeah.
And I actually think that the change in the mood of Ireland in the 80s against Catholicism, against dogma, moving towards liberalism, moving towards, as you said, embracing outside influences, sowed the seeds of the subsequent increase in the economy, which has been transformative and totally and utterly unpredicted. This is the key.
Yeah.
If you go back to what economists were saying in the 1980s, not one said this economy is going to take off. In fact, the narrative at the time was that we were sort of condemned to economic underachievement. right? That was our lot, that Ireland was a kind of a bit of a basket case and we made a mess of everything, right? And lo and behold, what happens in the 90s, 2000s, the thing takes off. And I believe it's because the mood of the nation changed. Nothing to do with Sean Lemass or T.K. Whitaker.
Yeah.
You hear all this stuff,
Yeah.
some big bloke wrote a paper in 1958 and the whole world changed. That's horseshit. That's not how economics works.
Yeah, but were those policies as a result of the change in thinking in the first place?
No, I think that those policies were, to use that Danish expression, a smorgasbord, John, of kind of good things that you could come up with, right? It didn't take a genius to realize that Eamon de Valera was a lunatic when it comes to economics, right?
Yeah.
That the idea that Ireland could be self-sufficient and we could look in and around ourselves and we could dance at the crossroads and we could be homely maidens and all that stuff. I mean, that was the economics of madness, right? So it wasn't some great moment of clarity. Basically what happened is Lemass and Whitaker wrote that paper in 1959 or 8. The economy didn't really start to move until about 1995. So if it was a good policy, it took a long time coming. I think much more likely is what John Burn-Murdoch says there, is that the mood and the attitude and what the society believed in began to change. And once you abandon dogma, religious dogma, economic dogma, you allow people to flourish and do their own thing. And that's what I believe happened here.
Well, let me ask you one last question just before we finish. On Tuesday, we spoke of long-termism and short-termism and super cycles.
Yeah.
So how or are super cycles dictated by or influenced by culture and language and thinking?
Absolutely. Culture. And I come back to the point that I was given this book by John Collison of Stripe called Where is My Flying Car?
Yeah.
And he is a technologist, one of the best in the world. And his idea was like, what happened to progress? How come we have a situation where we can't build enough houses when we know that actual fact in construction, the cost of construction, alternative construction has collapsed. We can do all sorts of stuff. And he's making the point that maybe it's to do with the attitude of the society towards progress has altered, which is exactly what John Burn-Murdoch is saying there. And super cycles are clearly affected by that. And the interesting thing about Ireland is I've always regarded what happened to Ireland is, remember, in hotels you had business centres, right? That Ireland became the business centre of Europe. Imagine that, right?
Yeah.
So
the coffee machine in the corner.
Coffee machine in the corner and it's sort of a laptop and la la la. Before mobile telephony, the business centre was a thing. Do you remember that? So people would go to a hotel and they'd explicitly go in there to do their business, right? And I think that's what's happened to Ireland. We've actually become the business centre of Europe. Maybe even the business centre of the Western world. A small one, but one itself. And that has got to do with the mood of the people. That has got to do with the way people think about the world. And I think if we abandon that thinking, then the super cycles will come and hit us very, very hard. But if we maintain that thinking and that openness and that liberalism and that tolerance, then I think we could push this thing on for another decade or two, this growth rate, which would be phenomenal. Anyway, I'll talk to you next week.